This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where in the world you're sitting. Thank you very much for joining us for this very first presentation of the results of our project Integrity in Education, which has been done in cooperation with Center for Applied Policy and Integrity and Network of Education Policy Centers and our members. The project has been funded by the Open Society Foundation, and we are in its final phase, and we're very happy to present our very first results to the audience today. Before I go further with introductions of the speakers and the agenda, let me just introduce myself. My name is Lana Jurko. I will be your moderator for today. I'm a little bit nervous. This is my first online panel that I'm moderating, and it has its own challenges. But I hope all together we will manage to get the best out of this technology that is available to us. I would also like to thank the CIES leadership for actually making this happen. I can imagine the huge challenge they were faced with trying to move the conference from face-to-face to online, and I think they did an excellent job. And just a few logistic things. I can see that you have all read and are keeping your microphones off. Please keep them off unless you'd like to speak or you're speaking. It will help us a lot with the echo or background sounds that might interrupt. Also, if you would like to ask a question during the presentation or afterwards, at the left part of your screen at the top, there is a little cloud that allows you to chat. Please, when you ask questions, use this opportunity. We will try to follow all the questions that come. And when you are asking a question, it would also be good if you could let us know who the question is for. It will help us in moderating. So yeah, we can start with the introductions of the agenda. So if we can go to the second slide. It will probably take a few seconds. Okay, we're trying to do it. Okay, so there is a technical problem of moving to the second slide. So maybe I can start the introduction without it, because I think I probably know most of it by heart anyway. So the presentation that we have today for you is Integrity of Human and Financial Resources in Education, Results of Locally Led Integrity Assessments in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova and Mongolia. Today's presenters will be Nina Bagdasarova from Foundation for Education Initiative Support in Kyrgyzstan, Maia Gelashvili from International Institute for Education Policy Planning and Management in Georgia, and they will present their country results for Kyrgyzstan and Georgia. And of course, we also have today with us Mihaylo Milovanovitch from the Center for Applied Policy and Integrity and Olja Jovanovic from University of Belgrade, who will present the synthesis of our results. Following their presentations, and we start first with the synthesis, then we move to Kyrgyzstan and then to Georgia. We will always also get comments from our two guests at the panel, Kate Lapham from Open Society Foundation and Tite Kovac-Cerovic, currently sitting in Austria, but also from Belgrade, from Serbia. So everybody, welcome. I will pass on the presentation now to Mihaylo, and I hope you all enjoy it, and we'll have lots of questions and a good discussion at the very end. So Mihaylo, here it goes to you.
Hello, thank you very much. Okay. I hope you see what I want you to see, which means the most gorgeous presentation ever, of course. about a number of important findings. If you don't see it, I'm sure that our moderator will tell me. In any case, this is a presentation that was prepared by several people, but because of time constraints, we decided that I'll be the one to take the blame for presenting it. So essentially, yes, this is a presentation of the results of the first presentation of synthesis results from the national reports of the 4 countries which participated in this project. I'm going to say something about this in a second. Essentially, just to say that this is an interesting project for different reasons. One of them is that we have been doing integrity assessments for a while now, and very often you have this kind of a very classical constellation in which you have an international team, and then you have national counterparts. And of course, the international team and international work will address the needs of the national counterparts, but it will still be this kind of a dual axis, like national, international. With this project, for the first time, we are really going into a situation in which these integrity assessments are fully locally led. So it's a joint project by NEPC and our center. And the idea is that civil society organizations from 4 countries, in this case, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, and Mongolia, following their own rationale, decided to implement this on their own, of course, in partnership with us. So this is part of a project that is really focused on the fact that this are locally led assessments. The timing of what we exactly did, essentially, yes, in September 2019, we had a training in which we had a chance to tell more about the methodology, the assessment, the evidence collection ways, and so on. Then there was a desk research phase in which our national counterparts worked, identified stakeholders, they had their evidence collection activities, and so on. In February this year, we had then a second capacity building and coordination meeting in which we discussed the first findings of the reports and the first outline of the synthesis. Now in March, April, we're in the phase where really the national reports are more or less finalized. There is also the next thing that we'll do after this session is to finalize the synthesis report, and then there will be a national dissemination follow-up for the remaining part of the year. To say what we exactly did, in fact, we have a questions, right? So we started with some question, and the first one is there kind of illicit or illegal conduct which takes place specifically in the area of human and financial resources in education in the countries which participate? And you see here already that we have made some choices. First, these 2 topics, and second, the question is that we have these 4 countries. So why these countries? Essentially, they're very interesting selection, and once you read the national reports, you start to understand even better why this selection is interesting. In all these countries, there's a high level of public awareness of corruption in education. There is media and social media reports like in Kyrgyzstan and Moldova. This recent research on corruption in education, quite a serious one, like in Mongolia. There's strategy or legislation against illicit conduct in education, like ethical codes in Moldova. Also, there's a track record of successful anti-corruption measures, like is the case in Georgia. So you see, like corruption and anti-corruption in education specifically is a topic which is pretty much a dominant part of the context in these countries. Also, in all these countries, the integrity research we did takes place in a time when one can already see quite well the impact of reforms, of education reforms, which all of them were long-term and wide-ranging. And there is also the thinking about the next step, a next generation of reforms, a fine-tuning of existing reforms. So essentially, it's a context that really marked by the impact of change and by the ambition for additional change. So essentially, the question was, can we have some insights on how these past reforms and the future plans might be influenced if we look at them through this integrity angle? So yes, this is why we have really selected both the topics in these countries. Also, the second question is, when this is already part of the first one in a way, we're looking into, okay, if we are looking into the context and we want to discuss illicit context, the question is, what role do education policy and practice actually play by facilitating and motivating such conduct? And essentially, the methodology which we apply with the conceptual framework it is one that really focuses on that. It puts the focus on education participants, on their environment, professional environment, on the question of why they do what they do. In what way, if we already identified that there is some sort of illicit conduct taking place in whatever area, in what way does this environment facilitate and motivate people to do things? So we're looking into circumstances in education, into integrity vulnerabilities, we call them, and the ways in which they motivate and facilitate integrity violations. So this is the conceptual framework in which we were working, and the two guiding questions were really, okay, let's start with identifying what kind of corrupt conduct is taking place or could be taking place in the specific area of education we're covering. In this case, human and financial resources in education, and second, what kind of vulnerabilities in the professional environment facilitate that. We had several methods of data collection. Like I mentioned before, we started with desk analysis, then which described the educational and social environment in which these integrity violations might be emerging. Then there was also focus group discussions in which we explored the different manifestations of the illicit conduct in focus, plus the vulnerabilities. And then in some cases, most cases actually, this was followed by in-depth interviews so that one can gain a specific insight in the perspective of people who participated in the focus groups. And you see in the sample that we have, the total covered is around 220 people. I said around because for some of the countries we are still double checking what is the exact amount of participants. In any case, you see that the effort to reach out and identify the right people and have them on board for this kind of in-depth explorations was considerable. So you can see here what the sample is. Now, what exactly did we find? And this portion of the presentation is about the findings by team and country. Before I say that, I just want to say that you're not going to hear any kind of summary of national findings here. The synthesis report is more about the secondary analysis of what we as external observers consider key findings. And this brings us to the second point, that in fact, what we as a team working on the synthesis report sees might not always be the same like what the national authors see. So we don't pretend that this is the absolute and one and only truth of what is in the national reports. It's a selection and necessarily perhaps a little bit of a biased selection. So I want to disclaim that. And having said that, if you really want to know what is happening in each country in great detail, I can warmly recommend you to look into this kind of level messages once the national reports are out and published, where you really see the findings per country. This presentation is more hovering around this, what we call level 2 and level 3 messages. Essentially, what is the synthesis? What are the main findings and observations around first theme, which is about teacher policies and favoritism in teacher policies, and the main findings around the second theme, which is about the management of financial resources and specifically parental donations. And of course, at the end of the presentation, there is an overview of what does it all mean? What are the commonalities between countries? What should we sort of take note of? Having said that, in the methodology we applied, we have 9 integrity violations that we have identified are the most common ones happening in education, no matter where you work and what country you're talking about. So out of this list of 9, which you see here include classical things like improper private supplementary tutoring, giving inflating or deflating grades on purpose, misappropriation of funds, procurement fraud, and so on. We are focusing on 2, on integrity violation 5. So we're trying to see, is there favoritism in teacher policies? And you see the definition of how favoritism is defined here. And also we are looking into violation number 6, misappropriation of funds in education. So we looked only in these 2, which doesn't mean that there are no other integrity violations happening in the 4 countries. It just means that we already had a pre-selection. And let's go first to the favoritism and see, okay, first question, is there favoritism in decisions about who is appointed as a teacher, who is fired, and who is promoted? Sadly, we can confirm, yes, there is, and the national reports are quite outspoken about that. What is more interesting, perhaps, is what kind of a manifestations this violation has. And here you see 2 important things. One is that really the majority of manifestations of favoritism are the same for both countries. They're comparable. So the inventiveness when it comes to corruption is really limited. You always see similar things come over and over again. What is different sometimes, it's really the context in which they happen. And we have like 4 which are really very common across these 2 countries that cover this topic. It's recruitment in exchange for bribes. It is like, you have quotes here, try to sort of illustrate what it really means in real life. Like that, you know, in certain places like cities, you would pay money, actually considerable amounts of money to get a teaching position. In rural areas, it might not be about money. It may be about non-monetary compensations. This is an example for Georgia. The second is intentional disregard for qualification requirements. Essentially, you want to hire somebody no matter what, perhaps because this somebody is your relative or a political affiliate, or perhaps just a friend. And you have every reason to do that by disregarding the minimum qualification requirements for this position. We have here an example from Moldova that of the 16 persons which were employed as teachers in a specific place, only 6 were holding teaching positions. And there is the example of the physical education teacher who not only is the son of the school director, he is also a lawyer, in fact, not a teacher, and he's on a payroll because they actually registered him as somebody who graduated at pedagogical university. This is the example of intentional disregard for qualification requirements. The third manifestation is when you have the undue influence on appointment decisions. I guess you have experienced this yourself, perhaps every now and then in a professional life. This is the notorious call by someone and then things happen. And there are some frustrated responses by some focus group participants, for example, like in Georgia, saying, you know, I know that I won't be hired because I don't have anyone to support me, but I'll try anyways. Maybe your committee is an exception. This is like from one of the application letters in Georgia. The fourth one is favoritism in distribution of workplace advantages. It's a very interesting manifestation because it really points to the range of problems in the environment in which it happens. Here you have that some people, because essentially when you have a school in which teachers are employed part-time or don't have a sufficient number of hours to ensure decent income, you might actually try to distribute the hours that are available to people that are somehow close to you. And here's an example from Moldova that the wife of the principal, who is a mathematics teacher, was employed as a full librarian and was appointed as an instructor in the cook group. And she, of course, she didn't do any of these things. And there are 2 manifestations which are more specific. One for Moldova, it's manipulation of performance evaluation. So despite an effort to introduce a proper system of appraisal and evaluation of teaching performance, it is being instrumentalized as a tool for, well, for punishment and for promotion of people who are loyal. And in Georgia, there's also one more interesting manifestation, it's mock recruitment of teachers. So essentially, they know they have to do some kind of a recruitment process, but it's very formal. Sometimes it will last only 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes there'll be a group interview of candidates just because it was clear in advance who is going to be hired. Now, the more interesting question here is why this happens, and I'm about to run out of time very massively, so I'm going to speed up through all that. In countries, in different countries, you have different variations of this, but essentially people, principals in many cases have a good reason to disregard qualification requirements just because they are concealed teacher shortages. So essentially for one or the other reason, there is nobody to hire, or there is not enough time to hire the proper people and so on. So this disregard is not only because people are friendly to you, it's also because sometimes you don't really have another choice. Regarding the undue influence on appointment decisions, you have also situations in which the recruitment procedures might be such that it's either impossible to apply them because they were not defined, or because the timing that was available, like in Georgia, was just too short. So this opens really the possibility for first for violations and second for manipulation. So you have a good excuse to hire people just like that. And in some cases also, this was also sanctioned by the authorities. For example, in Georgia, there's a big discussion in the National Report of how the ministry approved a degree which allows for people who, in fact, do not have any specific education, candidates with a bachelor diploma in any field, they can actually become teachers. And this was all done because there was no time, and everybody's aware that there's a shortage of candidates. I mentioned about the favoritism and distribution of workplace advantages. This is precarious employment conditions. So if you really have a situation in which people either don't have sufficient income or teaching is not attractive, you try to make these conditions more attractive, but they're just distributing internally the bonuses available and also the working hours available and so on and so on. And regarding the 5 and 6, there is also the problem of weak compliance control. Of course, things are not that simple. Some of these also influence others, so it's not very easy to have a clear-cut allocation of reasons and integrity violations. Sometimes one and the same weakness can be an explanation for more than one manifestation of the integrity violation. Just one remark: the recruitment in exchange for bribes. I tried to find a vulnerability or a reason why this is being done, but I really couldn't. So that's why I left a question mark here. As to the second violation, it's very interesting. I just want to say this about the parental donations, that if you look into whether parental donations per se are an integrity violation, it turns out that in none of the reports they're discussed as such. In some cases, because there's no evidence that somebody is directly stealing this kind of money. In other cases, this is just not being referred to in this way. So much more interesting is when we talk about parental donations, that they are really leading to, as a consequence, to integrity violations. So the parental donation is instrumental for something else. And you see the range of violations that are being enabled and facilitated by parental donations. In Mongolia, this is improper private supplementary services and procurement fraud. In Kyrgyzstan, there is a range of violations as well. And it's possible actually to cut through and group them in two. So in some cases, parental donations are misused as illicit payments to get a service that education should actually deliver anyway, such as proper education, enough time by teachers for instruction, or, for example, good working conditions for teachers. And also a second group is when parental donations are being used as a pretext. So you say my school needs support, financial support for maintenance, and then it is pretty clear in advance that this money is going to be misappropriated. It's a kind of procurement fraud scheme. Or a very interesting case from Kyrgyzstan is when schools which receive a lot of parental donations, and here you can see this on this table down here. It's here. This sorry, this is not what I wanted to do. Let me see what I can go back. I can, and then there is something like a laser pointer, and it's here, this one. So essentially, and what happens in Kyrgyzstan with parental donations, when we talk about the scenario in which parental donations use a pretext, is that schools which are known to be elite or able to generate a lot of income in this way, sometimes this very fact is being used to accuse principals of misappropriation and irregularity. So people are being removed and other people are being installed in their place, because this was kind of a sort of a way to resolve the problem. So it's a very interesting situation. So you have here an overview of what donation practices there are in the different countries, what vulnerabilities behind that, and it is really interesting to see that we are arriving at certain areas which are not particularly new. I'm not going to go through all of this because we can share this presentation afterwards and you can read what these are, and there are also comments which are very detailed. So what is really interesting in this is that if you try to sort of summarize what did we actually learn from this exercise, we are arriving at selection of weaknesses, selection of policy areas in which there are weaknesses, which, well, they're serious, they are, visible, but they're very unspectacular in the sense that there is nothing really new there. If we say, well, these are the 4 major areas of weaknesses, these are the 4 major weaknesses, such as lack of financial resources because of shortage of public funding, heavy reliance on private support, rigidity of public budget management, or like the gaps in teacher policies, which are precarious employment conditions, gaps in recruitment and all that, or weak quality assurance or substandard quality of education. None of these things is new. So if you look into that, you say, well, it's kind of disappointing. There's nothing really interesting. What is considerably more interesting here, and for me personally was also frustrating when I was preparing this slide, is that areas are A, they're not new, and then B, they're still around despite decade-long reform efforts to address them. So in a way, the Indepth assessments in these 4 countries, they revealed a lot about the way the integrity violations happen, yes, but they also revealed quite a lot about the failure of education policy and reforms over time. So this is like a very important insight because it allows us to look a little bit closer into the question of what kind of reforms were that and what exactly might have gone wrong. So you see there's an overview of reforms, and all the national reports start with that. So it's not really our invention that this is important. All reports start with that because it looks like the authors of the national reports consider this as an important element of the context. We have essentially reforms which are really meant to address the very same problems which appear to be still around. Plus, in all four countries, of course, you have the obligatory anti-corruption strategies and norms of ethical conduct. And if we have to group the kind of gaps that are still there and what exactly might have gone wrong, judging by the information in the national reports, which in turn creates vulnerabilities, which leads to integrity violations, you have three scenarios. First is partial implementation of reforms. For example, in Mongolia, yes, Mongolia was committed for a decade to a rapid expansion of access to education, but this happened at the expense of unevenness. So essentially, you have very short shifts. You have opening of schools in areas where they might not be needed, and there are not sufficient number of schools in areas that they're needed. There's also very short shifts, like I said, and overloaded curriculum. So essentially, you have like a hidden shortages. Or in Moldova, where there's a new generation of recruitment policies, and the promise there'll be methodology of how this should be done. And this methodology is due for 6 years now, and it's still not in sight. The second scenario is that there are disruptions and missed targets. Like in Georgia, it looks like the reforms that were meant to improve things, they in fact, in some ways, amplify the teacher shortages instead of addressing them. In Kyrgyzstan, per capita funding touted as the solution to the funding problems. In fact, due to low baseline, due to low normative, it did not resolve the problem of funding shortages. And also in Moldova, there was some new attestation procedures, which in fact did not lead to merit-based evaluation of teachers. And you have also the scenario in which there's a poor planning in design. In Georgia, this very interesting situation in which the time that was given for the change and for the recruitment of new teachers was excessively short. In Mongolia, the decisions about where to build new schools are based on political considerations and so on and so on. So essentially, we're talking about pre-existing long-standing problems which still remain somehow unresolved. What does this all mean if we talk about some kind of preliminary conclusions? Again, perhaps not very spectacular, but well, perhaps there's a chance to look at this once again. First, the efforts to prevent illicit conduct, if this is the priority for follow-up actions, it will depend on how well they manage to address these underlying problems, and the integrity angle of this report really allows us to look into these old problems once again, perhaps from a different perspective. The second is the discussion about human and financial resource shortages is more discussion about the way resources that are already in the system are distributed, rather than about the full absence of resources. Some of these countries really spend a lot, and still there are shortages. This is really a contradiction which requires further exploration. The integrity angle, like I said, might help to reassess the impact of some education reforms and perhaps discuss a way to remedy that impact. And we think that this is high time to do that. And finally, one conclusion that we've seen also in other countries is that people in education really always have a good reason to do what they do, even if it's problematic and informal. So it's worthwhile investing in understanding these reasons, because this is the key to designing a better set of changes and reforms in the future. So this is all, and sorry for running over time.
Thank you, Mihaylo. Of course, there's never enough time to say everything. You did your best with also very fast speaking. I hope everybody managed to follow that. I found the results are... Okay, somebody else is trying. Okay, we have an echo.
Sorry, I'm struggling with my screen.
It's okay, don't worry, Nina. I'll unmute you in 1 second, but when our two of us speak, there seems to be a terrible echo. So yes, Mihaylo, Olya, thank you very much for this preliminary presentation. I think we're learning a lot from this. Something that seems to always come back in education is that when you scratch somewhere, you find how this affects all the other parts. I think that this approach from integrity perspective really gives us a lot from the policy perspective to think about. I will now give the word to Nina, who will present the case of Kyrgyzstan in a little bit more detail. And of course, there will be time for discussions at the end. Okay, Nina, I will unmute you and mute myself.
Unmuted. I'm unmuted. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going also very quickly to oversee our review our research, and I will provide quite short country context for people who is not so familiar with Kyrgyzstan. That as in other post-Soviet countries, there is a lot of problems with school budgeting. We don't have enough money. This is the obvious, for many people obvious reason for integrity violation. In Kyrgyzstan, also the issue of parental contributions is very much politicized, and it's usually at the eve of elections, it became much more hot than it is in other years, for example. And recently, we have a lot of public protests, demonstrations, and disturbs about this issue. And we also conducted our research in Bishkek, the capital city of Kyrgyzstan, and this is quite specific situation in Bishkek because the schools in Bishkek are overcrowded. So a lot of things that might be possible to do in other schools are impossible to do in Bishkek because the financing, standard financing per capita doesn't work in Bishkek. The city have more students than they actually can afford. So they don't, at least for budget money, they don't compete. Probably, and I will say later about that, they may compete for parental money, but not for the budgeting money. We define parental contributions as formally voluntary payments by parents collected by the schools. Why they are formally voluntary? Because a lot of parents probably are not very happy to pay this money, but they have to if they want to enter some schools that they prefer. And some disparity, the difference between quality of education in different schools within the city is very high. So some schools are very popular, some schools are less popular, and in the most popular schools, the contributions are higher. And the analysis that we use, how we consider the structure of integrity violations, Mihaylo said already about that. We look into incentives and we look into opportunities why these violations take place. So how we did our research? We decided to look into these different types of school because really the contributions are differ in each type of the school. And we chose three types of schools. We went in one school that we call elite or expensive school with very high level of parental contributions, which is very, very demanded by citizens of Bishkek, and people are trying to enroll their children into this school from different districts of the city. They're coming there no matter what price they pay. Then we have more or less average municipal school, which is not bad, but it's not so expensive and not as popular as the first one. There is a number of these kind of schools also in the city, and the contributions in these schools are lesser than in elite schools, but much higher than is some schools that are situated in the outskirts of the city, in so-called districts of Novostroyka. That's new districts and schools that we call it disadvantaged schools. They collected the minimal amount of money from the parents for the very, very necessary needs that they have to cover. And as Mihaylo said, I will not talk about that in many details. We use in-depth interviews, focus groups. Of course, we conducted desk research. Also, we analyzed media discourses because of these recent public events and protests that we have now. We looked into people's opinion about this issue. And during the focus groups, we used the storytelling technique. And I'm just quickly show you what kind of instruments we had. That's the examples of the questions for interviews. They are more or less open, and we just tried to listen to directors and actually then analyze what they told us. And again, because of this high level of politicization, I should say it was very difficult to find the directors who would will to participate in our research. All of them were resistant, at least at the beginning, because I will say later a little bit about that, but most of the directors feel themselves at risk because any financial issues that people start discussing might actually jeopardize their position as directors. And for dynamic storytelling, we use this kind of stories. So this is very short and very regular kind of situation where school might need some additional money. In this case, I show the story number 3. We used 4 stories that people discussed, parents in focus groups discussed in small groups, and they had to continue the story and suggested us how this story ended. In this case, it was collection money for windows repair for school. And just to show that actually parental contributions is a inevitable part of school lives, this is the structure of the high school financing for the rural school. So this is the biggest, the largest standard per capita sum. So the other grades, they had less money. And as you see, the budget, the money that is going to schools from budget are mostly spent to the salary for teachers. This is 80% of this money. And other expenses are barely covered by budget money. Moreover, there are some requirements by law on education. For example, schools have to provide security service, but there is no such kind of expenses planned in the budget at all. So in all schools, usually parents have to collect money for that. What is actually in common between all these schools, what we discovered, and it was not a big surprise, the most important incentive for parental contributions is the demand for quality of education. Most parents want to enroll kids to the school with the better quality of education. But in many cases, a lot of families just cannot afford some really expensive schools, so they try to, let's say, a bit cheaper options, and sometimes they don't have choice at all, so they go to the nearest school and pay the minimal contribution. And what is actually a little bit different in all these three cases, actually it was 4 case studies that we conducted. We went to 2 disadvantaged schools. In elite schools, people are readily paying these contributions and are not interested in many details. Actually, they are satisfied with the quality, and they, as they put it, it's much cheaper than send our children to the private school. It's like really like dozens times cheaper than send kids to the private school, but the quality of education is probably even higher than in any private school, in the school that we visited. In disadvantaged schools, parents just pay the very affordable amount of money, and as far as they not always capable to pay, they are very ready to do something in a more concrete way. They help with repair, they provide some materials if they have something, these kind of things. The most complicated scenario we observed in so-called average schools. I mean that are not such expensive, but also are not as cheap. In this school, we observed the highest level of distrust, the high level of interest in details, a lot of suspicions towards the parental NGO that collected money and other things. And that means that actually the parents from this school, the amount of money that they are paying does matter for them a lot. They pay attention to much more attention to that than parents in the elite schools that are probably just richer and can afford easier the contributions that they do. So when we come to analysis, we excluded two types of integrity violations, cheating and accreditation license fraud. We decided that it's not directly connected to parental contributions. So we focused on illicit provision of access to education, improper private supplementary services, politicization of education, undue recognition of students' achievements, favoritisms in staffing decisions, misappropriation of funds, and procurement fraud. I'm just say a couple of words about each of these violations. Illicit provision of denial of access to education was much more visible in elite schools because there is a lot of broken rules in order to enroll children into these schools. And there are some vulnerabilities in the policy because the enrollment in school controlled by not only by Ministry of Education but also by local authorities, and it's quite easy to cheat, or it's not cheating, but you can fake the documents that you belong to this area, to the territory of this school, so you can be enrolled into this school. And sometimes if you are eager to get inside, you can suggest director the kind of big voluntary contributions. So actually this is the bribe for getting your kids into this school. We didn't find out anything about improper private supplementary services, but we should say that there is opportunities and there is incentives for that violation, because actually schools have right to provide additional services, but they should be beyond the curriculum that is taught by beyond the required curriculum. But nobody actually look carefully into this supplementary school. So we don't know, for example, some math circle for students interested in math, are they busy with something beyond the curriculum issues, or they just get additional preparation and get better achievements because they pay for this service and get this supplementary service from school. The very interesting for Kyrgyzstan is this level of politicization of education, and we actually combine this violation with another one, with favoritisms of staffing decisions, because in our case it's very difficult to divide these two violations, because when we have some political changes, for instance, the new Minister of Education came, some staff members also, they are looking for new staff members, and sometimes they get in position of the let's say expensive or school that we describe as elite school with a high level of parental contributions, might be kind of how to say, kind of payment for political support during the campaign, for example, elections campaign, when this person knew that he or she will be granted the position of the minister or something like that. So the financial issues and some kind of getting access to some parental money is inseparable to some political constellations, and it's quite often is related closely. And in some cases, the parents also might be involved in the protests or start some, I don't know, some even court suits against the directors in order to spare their position and get some desirable new director or for this place. So actually, why again? Why all directors that we
Nina, can I just warn you? You have run out of time, but I'll give you 2 more minutes. Okay.
Okay. So I have only 3 violations, so it's okay. Okay, so this is highly politicized kind of violation, let's say. Again, the payments might be connected to undue recognition of underestimated or overestimated achievements of students. Students sometimes depends on the parental contributions. And misappropriation of funds and procurement fraud were also combined. And I should say that in Kyrgyzstan recently it was a big progress about making these issues much more transparent because there is no cash collection of money anymore. Directors stay away of this money. All money are going through banks accounts, and also the government tried to introduce the official accounts that should be controlled by board of trustees, not parental NGOs. And these national treasury accounts, official accounts, are completely controlled by government, but they are extremely inflexible and very inconvenient for using. So what also important that we found out that media actually might be, we can interpret it 3 the media positions might be divided in 3 types of attitudes. That parental contributions should be forbidden because it's against the constitutional rights for education. The second position is that that's inevitable and parents are ready and to pay because it's impossible to just go on. Schools just would be closed without that. And the third position is that there need some additional budgeting for schools, but not parents, but other actors should pay for that. For example, some business cooperation or local communities contributions and other types of things might be involved. And also,
okay, Nina, can I stop you here? I see that you're going into details about recommendations. We will share the slides with all our participants.
Great. Okay.
And we might have some time. We are already getting a lot of questions, so I really want to get to those as well at the end of discussion. Thank you very much, Nina. We'll move now.
I will answer questions.
Yes. Okay. We will answer them in the panel, or if we don't have time, in other modes. But for now, Maia, can you take over from here now? Thank you very much. So Maya will, of course, there's always much things that we want to say, and time is always too short. But yes, we want to also give enough space to hear the Georgian case. So Maya, please go ahead.
Can you see the presentation? Okay.
Yes.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maia Gelashvili. I represent International Institute for Education Policy Planning and Management. And our case was regarding recruitment of school teachers in Georgia and integrity assessment of this process. So just to give you general overview, as of the data of 2018, we had 60,000 teachers employed in public schools in Georgia, and average age of those teachers were 50 years, which is one of the highest among OECD countries, which showed that the system was aging a little bit, and it was necessary for the country to make some kind of actions in order to avoid teacher deficit in the years to come. Therefore, it was quite timely that this summer, the ministry announced an initiative to give teachers of retirement age a monetary reward in case they voluntarily left the system. And so out of 6,000 teachers of retirement age out of 15,000 teachers, 6,000 actually took the reward and left the system, which created an unprecedented number of vacancies for teacher positions in Georgia. And from August till October of 2019, there was this huge hiring process of teachers. So actually, this was the reason why we chose this topic to study, because our data collection phase coincided with this phase of huge teacher hiring process in the country, which gave our team a very unique opportunity to actually study the process as it was unfolding and to actually analyze what was going on and to prepare relevant recommendations for the policy in future, because these steps are planned to be done in future as well, but we studied only this specific time period from August till October 2019. So we, of course, utilized INTEST methodology, and I won't go into these details. And for data collection, we utilized desk research when we analyzed, most importantly, all the national legislation which was in relation to these changes and different articles, interviews, etc. And also we conducted focus group discussions and in-depth interviews. So overall, we had 3 focus group discussions with 29 participants. We had focus group discussions both in regions and in capital, which was very important because situation is a little bit different in regions. And we included teachers who, of course, undergone this hiring process. And we had teachers who got hired, teachers who got rejected, and also teachers who were hired, who were rejected by some schools but hired by other schools. And as for in-depth interviews, we had 16 in-depth interviews with school principals, deputy principals, ministry representatives, education experts, etc. What was the main finding of this assessment is that, first of all, it's worth mentioning that most of our respondents, and most importantly, all stakeholders, like teachers who got hired, teachers who did not, like education experts, school principals, absolutely everyone evaluated this reform very, very positively and said that it was a very big and very good step forward for the system, because so many job openings appeared, and they hoped it would help to hire very qualified young teachers and to rejuvenate the system. However, they identified several obstacles which were on the way of these positive changes, and also during our integrity assessment, we did find these obstacles as well. To give you very shortly, we found 3 main things which created opportunities potentially for integrity violations. These were improper planning and implementation of education policy, accelerated changes and lack of consistent monitoring system, non-transparent and very close nature of recruitment reforms. All of these could foster and can foster integrity violations, but also, unfortunately, we did identify actual integrity violations as well. And now I will try to get into a little bit more details. So the first one I will stop on actually regulatory and policy level and what we identified which could potentially foster integrity violations. So the first of all, which was extremely visible, was very poorly planned recruitment process. So ministry initiated a centralized procedure of teacher hiring because it was like so many vacancies and so little time left. But the thing is that the announcement was made that schools should announce competitions at the same time, so it was common dates for everyone. But the dates, the novelty about this announcement was issued on August 21st, and announcement by school should be made on the following day. And afterwards, applicants had only 10 days to apply to vacancies, and only 2 to 3 days were actually allocated for holding interviews. And this everything was aggravated by the fact that the school year was going to start on September 16th. So you can see how tight the deadlines are, and this created a very, very chaotic situation because, for example, from the perspective of teachers, they were running from one interview to another, and sometimes they couldn't get to all the interviews they wanted because the time coincided, the interview times at different schools. And also from the perspective of principals as well, because they had very little time left till the school year began. They had to hire someone, and not all applicants who could came to the interview, so they just hired people who were available and not potentially the best candidates they could find. Another regulatory at policy level impropriety we found was very, very simplified qualification requirements for novice teachers. So according to the changes in legislation, a person with only bachelor's diploma could become a novice teacher, and this bachelor's diploma didn't even have to be in the same field where they are going to teach. But the fact is that this is a novice teacher, which means that he or she should work under the supervision of the tutor for 2 years. And within these 2 years, this person has to take a teacher preparation program. And only after taking this program, this person can teach independently. But because the timeline was so strict, some teachers, some novice teachers got hired like a week before the starting date of teaching at school, and not all of them were allocated a tutor or supervisor. And also another thing is that due to this legislation amendment, there is a little change that also these candidates can take not only the regular teacher preparation program, but also a distance learning program. But the thing here is that in Georgia, teacher profession is a regulated profession, and any kind of teacher preparation study programs have to undergo accreditation procedure. But as for distance learning, in Georgia, we do not have any legal regulations or accreditation procedures for distance learning programs. So this created a problem as well, because we are saying that this novice teacher, he or she can go through a distance learning program, but at the same time, this program is not hasn't undergone any kind of quality assurance procedures. So due to this thing, it created an opportunity for integrity violation as well, because like decision makers could, under disguise of shortage of teachers, hire anyone with just bachelor's degree. So Here is another window for violations as well. As for the actual integrity violations, like the majority of our respondents did say that, of course, there are integrity violations in hiring process, and most of them had an expectation that those ones who do have someone who could ask for them or say for them, they would have better chances of getting hired. And also we had cases that school principals actually received phone calls from city or regional administrative offices, different educational offices in support of certain candidates. And also, actually, these two integrity violations was something which we expected because this is like widespread practice in Georgia. But what was extremely unexpected to find out was that after this hiring process was over, we saw different thank you letters in social media. Then people who got hired due different kinds of protectionism actually were thanking their patrons via social media. So this speaks about the fact that these people didn't even consider this as integrity violation and didn't even think it was something to be hid or something in those lines, which was actually extremely surprising even for research team. So also what we found was mock recruitment processes. Like the majority of the teachers we spoke to said that the interview process was very interesting, very detailed, and so on and so forth. But some of them said that in sometimes it felt very formal because it was very short, like from 2 to 3 minutes. Sometimes it was group interviews, and they had an not anticipation, but they thought that maybe candidates were already pre-selected for those positions and interviews were held just to satisfy formal requirements. And also we had cases that actually candidates were invited to the interview, but different acquaintances told them, you know, don't go to the interview because we know a candidate is already selected for the position and it's just formality. Another thing is recruitment in exchange of bribes. Like several interviewees did mention that they have heard that there were some kind of monetary rewards for positions, for teaching positions, but we actually could not determine the scope of this or actual facts of this, so we cannot say that it actually happened in reality. But because of the fact that several interviews did mention this during interviews and focus group discussions as well, we can assume that it did happen to a certain level. Now, another thing which created vulnerability in the system and could also foster integrity violation is the fact that there is no follow-up or monitoring mechanism of how actually the reform was held and how the whole hiring process was going. Because, for example, when we collected the information, we very much wanted to have data of how many actually vacancies were filled in, whether there were any kind of deficits in schools left, and whether the candidates who were selected actually satisfied the qualification requirements set out for them. But unfortunately, we couldn't find this data anywhere, and from the ministry and its centers, we received an answer that the solicited information cannot be provided simply because they do not collect this information. Which means that if you don't collect this information, you have no ways to evaluate or monitor the system. Also, another thing which came out was the low awareness of stakeholders and generally lack of information regarding this hiring process. Because even though all kinds of stakeholders said that it was a very positive reform, they also indicated that neither the reform nor the legislative changes were actually discussed with stakeholders like school principals, education experts, or different kinds of stakeholders, and the whole process didn't feel to be transparent at all. And also there among teachers, or not only teachers, but among like general people who might want to become teacher, there is a lack of information about the ways how to actually become a teacher, because in Georgia it's very complicated with kind of because there are different levels, different specifications of teachers, and you need different qualifications for each of them, and so on and so forth. And even the teachers who actually undergone this process and got hired didn't know all those like the details, how you are becoming a teacher and what kind of qualifications is necessary for what kind of positions, which was obvious from our focus group discussions. And also educational experts indicated as well that there was no hiring campaign or something to explain to general public actually how you can become a teacher. So based on all this information solicited, unfortunately we did find that there was an integrity violation in the system, and we worked on policy recommendations which would help the government to improve the whole process of teacher hiring and the teacher policy, because we do know that there are plans to repeat this because there are still many teachers of retirement age in the system. And if the government and Ministry of Education would consider our recommendations, we do think that the system and whole process could be improved. So, but I won't discuss in all the details these recommendations here, but I have them on this slide. So thank you very much for your attention.
Maya, thank you very much for a concise presentation and keeping to the time. Well done, you're the winner so far. We go now to the discussant, and I will do discussants first, and then I hope we can cover the questions which are coming in our chat. If you would like to pose another question, please do so. Kate, can we hear first from you?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for those presentations. I always find them to be incredibly rich in detail when we go to the country level. And I think that the INTEST, the methodology that you have used, is particularly important for the field because it connects first of all, it allows for a much more nuanced discussion of the manifestation of corrupt and corrosive practices in school than a lot of the traditional models of corruption or transparency. And it allows you to dig into very specific practices that manifest in different ways in different places, and yet connect them to overall trends in education, which I think is quite useful. It also connects the idea of the financing and budgeting and informal arrangements that pop up in education systems with issues of quality and equity and the ways in which learners experience being in their schools or being in their universities, which for education I think is particularly important because we know that the downstream effects of those experiences are incredibly important, and yet they take a long time to measure, and they're not so often connected to the much more technical issues of financing. I was also struck in these presentations how public budgeting often assumes the informal practices that you're talking about. So for example, when politicians or officials are making education budgets, they're counting already on parental informal payments, for example, to be coming into the system. So in some ways, these practices are quite explicit, even if they remain informal, which I think is an important finding for anyone who is interested in education policy or tax justice or any of the other financing related issues. And finally, I think this framework is unique because it looks at integrity issues that are not usually considered in other frameworks of transparency, like the politicization of schools and universities and the ways in which they directly interact with other types of corrupt or corrosive government practices that might not have a financial implication, but certainly have an implication for the strength of public institutions and the strength of democracy. And my question for the group, I think, is sort of what is next? The INTEST model has such tremendous potential as action research, right? And so uncovering integrity violations, but then also working with the people who have been research subjects to figure out how you might mitigate them or ameliorate them. And so in each of these countries, I'm very curious how that constituency has developed and what you think is the potential for collective action and then further research resulting so that we can see the changes in education integrity as a result of the process that you've begun through your research.
Kate, thank you very much.
Yeah, to Lana.
Thank you, Kate, very much for your comments and for your question. I hope we can answer some of it now and some of it as the project develops. Yes, our always question is how do we then now with all these findings actually do some concrete change at country level. But we will first go to Tinde for her comments and then we'll get back to your questions. Thank you, Kate, once again. Tinde, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for this fantastic presentation and study altogether. I see it as an impressive excursion into the flip side of education. And the flip side of education very often discovers much more about education and also the nice side of education than we actually think. Especially interesting for me is also to delve into an area which is not the typical educational area, the curriculum assessment, textbooks and principles, but it is looking into underlying policies which are the perverse financing or twisted teacher policies or lack of any teachers policies. And usually people who are engaged in education are not so much looking into that. Neither do parents really have the technical knowledge to delve into that. So I hope, and I'm fully supportive of the idea that this could really help to understand better these policies and their detrimental or positive effects if they are set up in a good way. Now, I think that it's absolutely essential and it's simply normal when it is such an amount of richness and interesting results that and convincing results that it's completely natural to jump to the question what and how should and could be done next. And I in that sense, I'm endorsing Kate's question also as mine, and I will just elaborate it a little bit further. But I also wanted to not forget a little bit of looking backward, because I think that it was also an interesting experience for you as researchers and as people who engaged in the whole process, and it would be an important part maybe of the synthesis report to collect also your experiences and your suggestions of what to do in this or that way and how to move the agenda forward. In some of the presentations or some of the papers it was more explicit, this was more explicit, in some it was less explicit, but I think that it is worthwhile to get into the what was easier, what was harder than expected, and what was fully unexpected. I don't think that the answer for that is at this moment possible, but I will just suggest for those who will write the synthesis report to think about that as well, and maybe what could be or would you need to make this exercise easier and somehow for you also enjoyable, fully enjoyable. Now, getting back to the forward looking, I think that it's important that we go into several layers of that. What should be done regarding integrity? That's the first and most obvious and salient question now. But I think that there is another question which is coming up also from Mihaylo's presentation. What should we do regarding education reforms? Because if the reforms are not functioning or not done well or whatever, then they will always create new integrity problems. And then I think that we should think also about what should be done regarding education if it allows for this kind of educational reforms, which are actually ending up in integrity problems. And then, of course, also to think about, well, what do we do with society, education, etc. Because I think that there are some commonalities between the countries which have not been explicated fully. There are always lack of funds, and that's not a universal phenomenon. There are countries where there are no lack of funds. There are demographic changes, mobilities, also political changes, and I think that there is also a problem with teacher initial education in all of these countries, which was not at all mentioned in the other presentations. So that would be an enrichment of the questions, thinking of how to help also who should do what, what should be schools, what should be done by schools, by civil society and policymakers, by government itself. The second layer is then how to deal with the unsuccessful reforms and not bring in some more unsuccessful reforms, because some of the remedies for these unsuccessful reforms will maybe create some future unsuccessful reforms and create some problems. As we know, today's problems are the yesterday's solutions. And one more level I would like to add is international level. On one hand, how can international organizations be more aware of how to take care and in the reforms which they are promoting, and also how to scrutinize the ways how some of the reforms which were presented through the work of international organizations, how they could have led to some of these, some of the issues which you found. This was not visible, at least how I read the materials. I didn't really see it, but I think that would be an ultimate benefit from the study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tinde. Lots of questions, little time. Maybe we can start just quickly. Mihaylo, if you would like to respond to the two discussants quickly, because there are quite a few questions from the audience and I would like to get to them as well. So Mihaylo, if I give you maybe 3 minutes to respond to the discussants, and then we'll go to the particular questions. Is that okay?
Absolutely, yeah. Let me just show my face. I'm still alive and I'm listening very carefully. These are great questions, and I don't say it because I'm polite, and they're really questions which partially emerged when we were preparing the synthesis presentation. There are also questions, I must say, which partially are already mentioned also in the national reports, but of course it's always a trade-off. So the presentation that we did on the synthesis shows a bit less than what is in the national reports. The question is only what do we do next? So I fully agree with that. Regarding what's next, the question that was asked both by Kate and Tinde, I can only say what we see as potential for follow-up, in addition to the formal plans that we already have anyway, like the dissemination and the discussion and so on. Definitely, there are a lot of areas which can be researched even further, where we just scratched on the surface and realized that here you have a whole complex of problems which really needs maybe a closer exploration, so that we have even better insight of what is what, which again is probably a precondition for identifying who should do what, because we're not quite there yet. The question about international, the role of international organizations and so on, it is, in fact, I didn't mention this in the synthesis, but it is mentioned in quite a few of the reports. They start with that, reforms promoted by. So there is a possibility to reconstruct the trajectory of change until now and see, is there anything in the involvement of international players that could hold lessons for the future? What can we actually tell them? And closely connected to that, what Tinde also mentioned, it would be great, in fact, once we agree on what are the kind of the recommendations for follow-up that we will have in the synthesis, to in fact inject carefully curated international experience, good and bad, so that we actually send a message that these countries are not confronted with these problems in isolation. Others have been there too. The one part that's missing from the synthesis, and I must say that this is more of a trade-off than a kind of strategic decision, is the part with the recommendations. All national reports have very diligently prepared a section with recommendations of what needs to be done. There's a lot of potential in that as well, which I did not present in the synthesis, but once we look into that, I think that some of the answers might be there of what's next and why. So this is the part that will be in the synthesis report, but it was not considered in the synthesis presentation just because of time limitations. So we have a body of recommendations. Whether they're good or bad is a different question. Of course, there's always scope for, you know, for negotiation and improvement, but it's there. So this will tap into that. So the synthesis report itself would definitely have a much stronger focus on, okay, what do we suggest to the next, who, why, and so on.
Okay, thank you very much, Mihaylo. We can maybe just do, we have 3 questions from the audience. We have also let our participants know that if they want to receive the presentations after the session, that they should send us an email so that we know who they are and where to send it. For now, we'll start first with the particular questions per country, and they kind of cover both Mihaylo and Maia in one case, and then Mihaylo and Nina in the other case. Nina, I will leave you muted for now until I stop talking, because it seems that the biggest echo comes somehow from your. Okay, so the first question then goes to Mihaylo and Maia. And I've just lost it. 1 second. There it is. Will you possibly look at deprofessionalization of the teaching profession as a result of hiring non-professionals to teach in schools? And do you have rough data, at least on the size of these violations? So, who would like to go first? And did you understand the question?
I might leave this to Maia, because it really is the question about what is going on in Georgia. But I very much welcome this question. It will be an extremely interesting thing to look at, of how you go exactly backwards and not where you want to go with all the reforms. Okay. Because I've never heard of a reform that says we want to deprofessionalize the teachers. So there's no such thing. Officially, they want to go in the opposite direction. But so it's a very interesting question. But yes, I think Maia might be in a better position to answer that one.
Maia, go ahead, please.
So actually, this is the issue which was touched upon in Mihaylo's presentation, and then I gave it a little bit more details about this issue in my presentation. So first of all, I want to say that we do not have any kind of rough data, how many teachers, how many novice teachers were hired, and out of these novice teachers, how many of them had only bachelor's diploma in any field. Now, because as I mentioned, we did try to solicit this information, but we just could not, because no one is collectively evaluating this information. So this is the answer regarding the data. But as for the professionalization of the profession itself, I wouldn't say it actually happens, because this is an exception, and it states that people with only bachelor's diploma can become only novice teachers, which means that they are not allowed to be independent teachers. They do have to have tutors or supervisors, and plus they have to be novice teachers for 2 years only, and within these 2 years they have to take teacher preparation program. So actually, this cannot be called as total deprofessionalization of teacher profession. And also in the legislation, it's written that this is a transitional clause in the legislation. So this will be allowed up until 2023. No later than this period. But another thing is that even though it's for novice teachers only, even though it's for before 23 only, and even though they are required to have tutors, we did see that not in every cases schools are able to provide those tutors and supervisors. Like in most cases they do, but not always. And also we are very, very much concerned that this teacher preparation program can be substituted by distance learning teacher preparation program, which I also talked about in my presentation, which do not undergo any kind of quality assurance mechanisms, which of course is not something anyone in the education system would welcome, because this is a regulated profession. So there is like a yes or no answer. Like it's not a total deprofessionalization, but this bit of the legislation is truly problematic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maya. We have a question for Mihaylo and Nina as well. It's rather long. I'll try to read it out correctly. So you're raising an issue of politicization of education. And is there any data on links between school principals of elite schools and politicians? So is there more like connection between elite school principals and politicians? There is an assumption that school principals in those schools are a class of their own, and this allows their collections, as they probably do some kickbacks to those politicians who cover their acts. Probably it's a whole scheme, as well as school principals are active members of some political parties which support them. So any thoughts about this connection between elite school principals, politicians, and how does this actually work? Maybe we go to Nina for this rather than Mihaylo. So Nina, go ahead. I will unmute you just on 1 second, sorry. There you go.
Okay, so quickly I will answer to this question. Actually, we didn't find out anything about connections between politicians and elite schools, but we do have data about connections between politicians and disadvantaged schools, because disadvantaged schools that are not such independent, they are much easier go to some agreements with politicians in exchange to some good things that they can get during like for the elections, for example. And also they are much more territorial, and for politicians it's more important to address to some specific audience, so they are very interested in these schools that keep close look and have close ties with parents at the specific territories. So probably the elite schools are participating in schemes and so on, but during this research we didn't reveal anything like that. For me, directors of many of these schools are quite vulnerable and unprotected figures, and our recommendations are addressed this issue.
Okay, thank you, Nina. I have one more question for you, so I will keep you unmuted. I hope it doesn't create too much of an echo. And the question is about what are the effects of the stratification, so the socioeconomic stratification, the way that you described your schools, the elite schools, the average schools, and the disadvantaged schools. Is this already seen in the society? And what are the consequences of that? Are they visible?
I know where is the cause, where is the consequences. Is the stratification the result of like graduation from different types of school? For these types of schools, have this already have this stratification, and parents don't have opportunity to send children to specific schools. But of course, the inequality in the society is closely related to the unequal access to education. That's definitely is the fact, and it's visible how much children go into universities from elite schools to continue their education, and how many are going to how many of them went after disadvantaged schools? Not so many.
Thank you,
try
Nina.
to be.
Yes, I understand. Of course, it's not easy to answer such questions like this, and there are a lot of things that we could add to this discussion. For now, this is all the questions from our audience. I will just give Mihaylo a final word if he would like to say something before we close the panel. Mihaylo, anything else that you would like to add that like you urgently need to say to us?
What I urgently need to say is thanks for your patience. We ran out of overtime only with 8 minutes, which is great because, in fact, I ran myself overtime like by 15. So we're improving somehow miraculously. Thanks for moderating. And because I know that Lana will not thank herself, I have to do this on her behalf. So thanks a lot for moderating. No, I don't have anything. I'm really very much looking forward to an internal exchange on the synthesis report once the draft is distributed for some comments. And I think we're going to have a lot of interesting experiences and discussions when it comes to the question of follow-up recommendations and so on. So the real action, the real value of all this is what is happening in your countries. The synthesis is just a door opener so that people get excited about what you have to say, in fact.
Thank you very much, Mihaylo. I would like to thank all of our speakers and our discussants for this time, and for those who listened and wanted to participate. From NEPC side, what we can promise you is in the next few months, as the reports are finished and finalized, that we will do our best to disseminate and try to do some actions on country level with the recommendations. We were very excited to start this project. Integrity has always been part of the NEPC mission. We're happy that we now have this cooperation with the center, but also with our members in 4 countries, and maybe we can further implement it in other countries in our region. So thank you very much again for your patience, for your time, for your presentations, and I hope that we will be in touch either online or somehow finally face-to-face after the world changes back to the new normal, as they call it. So goodbye, everybody, and thanks again. Ciao. Stay safe.